peace in the name of the Most High. Jah, Rastafari, who liveth and reigneth with I and I continually. May Jah bless and guide all who hear. You might be a Wall Street banker, living high off the hog. Or you may be one check away from homelessness. You might even be the American League batting champion, batting .333. And it can happen to you in a moment of time. Life changes. Life changes. You may be a suburban housewife or the policeman. You may be Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or Green. And it can happen to you in a moment of time. Life changes. Life changes. You may be a rapper. You may be a long-haired hippie. Or even a dreadlock Rasta. And it can happen to you in a moment of time. Life changes. Life changes. Due to a disease called cancer. Reggae and Rasta speaks to a history, both collective and personal. In this tree, there are those who can remember exactly what they were doing December 7th, 1941. My mother, Helen Louise Jones, told the story about how she was sitting, doing her homework in her Washington, D.C. home with her father, my grandfather, Sandy Evander Jones, listening to the NFL radio broadcast between the Washington Redskins and the New York Giants, when the bulletin came across with President Roosevelt saying that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Another generation remembers exactly what they were doing on November 22nd, 1963. I was in a third grade classroom, Miss Amato's room, hoping that she would pass me by when asking the math questions, when the principal, Mr. Jerzik, came in and spoke to Miss Amato. I remember the tears. And I remember running home, feeling like I needed to tell my mother because I knew she had to be watching the world as the world turns and couldn't possibly know this earth-shattering news that had just happened. Now there's another generation that remembers exactly what they were saying and doing on September 11, 2001. All those are examples of collective histories and collective stories. But this story is a personal one, and it began on December 2nd, 2009. And it started just like any other day for me. You know, the alarm goes off, and there's Minnesota Public Radio. And then after a couple of hours of listening to NPR, there would be the switch on the dial to Paul Allen and KFAN. December 2nd, 2009 started out just like that. But there was something a little bit different, because instead of going straight to work and catching the number 21 bus on the corner of Snelling and University in St. Paul, there was going to be another little trip to the West Bank to see a doctor. You got to know that what a big deal it was for me to see a doctor. My own father, Evans H. Daniels, Jr., was a doctor, the first black doctor in Hartford, Connecticut. And for different reasons, I hated doctors. But going back a few months before, I had begun to get these dizzy spells. The first time I noticed was during a trip to Denver where I was performing Black Hippie Chronicles. It was also a time when my daughter was heading off to school in California. This was an exciting time, and the first time the dizzy spell hit, I could blow it off. You know, after all, I would pride myself for years about never getting sick. I would take my sick days at work and sometimes add them onto vacation days. I used to pride myself in the fact that I wouldn't as much as get colds. So a simple dizzy spell wasn't going to affect me. And besides, I knew this about myself. I tended to hold things in. A bit of excitement. Feeling a little bit feverish in doing the show in Denver, but it got through. Upon return, the dizzy spells continued, followed by a period of shortness of breath. Now, ironically, just about a month before, I had decided to quit tobacco. It had nothing to do with health reasons. It had more to do with saving money. But when the shortness of breath came around, I thought perhaps tobacco had caught up to me. But that still wasn't enough to get me to the doctor. It took a combination of things. Now a third thing began entering in, and now we're into November. And anyone who has spent time in Minnesota knows that compared to January, November nights are tropical. This tropical evening, and tropical evenings after that weren't so tropical. Though it may be 40 or 30. I felt as if it were 10 or 15 degrees. I knew I needed to go when, upon getting off the 21A bus, heading to my Midway apartment in St. Paul, I was worried that the police might want to pick me up because I had to sit and kneel, sometimes for 5 minutes on the corner before walking. But then again, the old adage would come up, you know, the old athlete in me, the old former basketball player that would just say, get up. Get up. There's nothing wrong. But feeling that there were rumors going around at my workplace. And so I thought perhaps it was time, particularly while I had health insurance, to take this trip to the doctor. I go to the clinic on Minneapolis' West Bank. I get let in. It's the usual, take the temperature. Everything seems fine there. The blood pressure, they put the wrap around. It feels a little bit tight on your arm, but then they let go. All is well. I'm thinking perhaps I will get out of this appointment with no worries whatsoever, and then it happened. The nurse pulled out the needle. And immediately I went back to a time in Hartford, Connecticut at Mount Sinai Hospital when my tonsils were being removed. As a young kid, I thought this was an exciting adventure. But then once I saw the needle, I began to kick and writhe and kick and writhe. Next thing I can remember is folks, the intercom, telling doctors and nurses to come to this room for an emergency. It took 8 nurses and my mother to hold me down for a simple blood test. And I saw this sign re-emerging when I saw the needle. I had to stop the nurse for a minute and say, you know, nurse, I do not like needles. They hurt. Can we get by without doing this? And of course the nurse said no. We had to go on. Took a deep breath. Turned my head, put the arm out. I felt the prick. And the nurse said to go home. Go on. Still feeling like shit, but then no one had told me anything, so I guess it's time to go to work now. Early December at a small retail shop on Lake Street in Minneapolis. You know, we were just a couple of weeks away from the beginning of the holiday season, but this particular afternoon, things were rather quiet. There were a few things to continue to do. Straighten up the aisles, straighten up the merchandise, attend to, maybe the 1 or 2 customers that were passing through the door. But as the afternoon is continuing, I'm still feeling bad and feverish. The afternoon goes by, and soon bosses are gone. Most co-workers are gone. No word from the doctor, so I'm thinking perhaps everything, even though I'm feeling bad, maybe everything is A-okay. But I'm still feeling bad and it is quiet. So I decided to do something that normally the old Puritan worker, something the old Puritan worker wouldn't do. I look around, the co-workers are quiet. I think I would want to take a short, quiet tap it. I felt like I could have been there for much longer, but then I heard the bell. We had a bell at our retail store on Lake Street that let us know when customers were arrived. Now the normal routine would be, if things were quiet at the store, maybe about 15 minutes or a half hour before the store closed, I would do all those things that were necessary to shut the store so that by 6 o'clock, I could walk out, play my usual game where even if I saw the 21A bus heading to St. Paul on Lake Street, where I would dart and pretend I was a Major League ball player, running across, beating cars, and getting to the bus stop on time. Everything seemed like it was going to work that way when the bell rang, and yes, we had a customer. I don't know whether any of you believe in angels or faith or timing or, anything to that sort. After this incident, I began to wonder. This customer took 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it's 5 minutes to 6. Now I know that there's absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to catch this bus. She finally bought one item 2 minutes before 6. 5 minutes after 6, I leave the building. And let me tell you a little bit something about timing. Dr. King once spoke about a time when a knife stuck into his heart, and if it had just been about 5 inches closer, we would have not had the Nobel Peace Prize winner, or the history making at the time that he did. These 5 minutes were, once I walked out the door, and still the heart is still beating, the breath is still short, and I'm still getting these dizzy spells. If I had done the usual, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story today. Instead of running, I walked to the bus and got to the stop to see the bus pull away. This was early December, but it's still feeling cold. And I knew the next bus going to St. Paul was going to be at least another 20 minutes and another 10 minutes before I would get home. In early November, my hands are cold, and I'm looking at them. They're looking and feeling as if it were a January day. I'm figuring the best thing to do is not to wait for the next bus, but to call one old reliable, one that we would call the grumpy one. Now the grumpy one and I would go back. We went back for years. We first met at the New Riverside Cafe on the West Bank in Minneapolis. Eventually somehow, and don't tell me how we ended up this way, we ended up sharing a space in the Holsterman building in Minneapolis' West Bank. These tiny, old, broken down and shared bathrooms building on the West Bank. We were involved in the founding of the Reggae Theater Ensemble. Created stirs where the grumpy one and myself lit joints on stage. We knew how to work with crises. We later on had my daughter living with us at 2 different times. Certainly, we knew how to deal with crisis. And the grumpy one had his own health issues. So we knew the drill. Grumpy one calls, I let him know, hey man, it is cold outside, can you please pick me up? He told me he would be there as quickly as he could. Now for a person who doesn't eat a whole lot of meat, a McDonald's would be an unlikely landmark. But the grumpy one, when I told him how cold I felt, he told me to go to the closest place that could keep me warm. The closest place from the bus stop was a McDonald's across the street from the bus stop. Went over there, ordered my Coke, sat for about 5 minutes, and sure enough, the grumpy one comes pulling up in his big white trunk. We were sitting there for about 5 minutes inside when finally there comes a phone call. And it was the doctor. Now I'm thinking, okay, we're finally going to find out what it is as the grumpy one starts to take me home. We're pulling up in the car, we're beginning to drive out of the driveway when the words come across. We need you to go to the hospital immediately for an emergency blood transfusion. I looked at the grumpy one and said, well, here are the 2 hospitals. Which one shall we go to? He said, let's go to University Fairview. And we began to trek. Now Now this time, instead of him telling me who I need to call, I am telling him. Yes, you call my daughter. You call my brother. You call this person. You call Thomas. Somehow it all seemed different. The shoe was on the other foot. We arrived at University Fairview Hospital. We're greeted with a wheelchair. The aides look at me as we go on into the room. I'm already in kind of a state of shock hearing that I'm having to deal with a blood transfusion. But I now know that things are real serious when I see the oxygen popped into my nose. Transfusion, I can't remember how long it took, but then I was going to be transferred to another room in the hospital. As the grumpy one's coming in and out of my room, I'm getting the sense that there's concern with him. I mean, all we know right now is that I have a blood transfusion, but I'm looking at him and I'm seeing that he's being real concerned, he's being real worried. And this is causing me to wonder what is going on. After the transfusion, I get rolled up into a hospital room. Next thing you know, I'm being stuck with every type of monitor you can imagine. And now I'm powerless to do anything when doctors and nurses come in and even poke me with a needle in the stomach. The only redeeming factor of that evening was seeing the grumpy one show up in my room at 4 o'clock in the morning. Asked him how he did it. Told me something to the fact that he's a hospital veteran. He knows his ins and outs around the hospital. Next day, the doctors talked about all the possibilities of what could be taking place. Came through as one of them. Took another day or two, but then the word came out. The doctors talked, I was hearing before how the doctors would talk about how amazing it was that I walked into the hospital. I remember them taking a look at my fingers and saying, you know, they are curved in a certain way, like a certain rigor mortis was beginning to set in. So then a day or two later, it became official. The doctors told me, and the word came that I was facing stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma located in the bone marrow. Jah, forgive us. Clouds running through the land, affecting good and evil. Jah laments. Jah laments. And Jah feels the suffering of his people. There's a certain word that talks about in a certain time that dreams come to old men and prophecies. And I don't know whether anyone in this room believes in dreams or prophecies, but I can just tell you this. Once before this situation, I had some dreams. It felt as if there was a tornado coming and ripping up everything in my life, taking it from foundation and turning it upside down. I didn't know the meaning of this dream. When I thought about it, I thought perhaps it had to do, maybe perhaps just something to do with the economy. Maybe I needed to worry a little bit about my work situation. But this dream was ever present. When it became time to renew my apartment lease in my St. Paul apartment, I had the option of 3 different choices. I could have chosen the easy route, which would have been a little more expensive. It was the month-to-month. I could have chosen a 6-month lease. But of course, the thrifty nature of myself decided I'm going to go ahead and sign another year lease. But as I'm signing, even as I'm signing it, I'm having this bad feeling, like something wasn't quite right, even though rationally this seemed like the right thing to do. Now, I understand the meaning of this dream. My life is now being turned upside down. And instead of catching the 21A bus from the University in Snelling to Lake Street in Minneapolis, I'm on my way for chemo treatment. Now, one thing you learn when you enter that room, you find out that there are a hell of a lot of people worse off than yourself. There was the old vet walking by, and one look in his eyes, you knew he probably wasn't going to be around much longer. And then there would be the child crying, with parents trying to put on a brave face, but panic nevertheless. I don't know what the hell I'm facing. This is something new to me. But the nurses are kind. You know, they want to explain what's going to take place. My arm goes up once again. This time, of course, given the condition, they're wondering, do you have any veins? And again, the jokes going back to the first few days in the hospital are taking place. Did I hear that you walked into the hospital? Yes, I walked into the hospital. I don't like needles, I don't like shots. Here we go again. But I'm too weak to fight this time, so the needle goes in to prick me. They offer a little bit of Benadryl to relax me. And I'm feeling rather relaxed. And soon the chemicals begin to be pumped in. Now, in some places later on, say like at the Rocky Mountain Cancer Center, everyone is all in one room, sharing the same television, sharing the same woes and worries. Here in Minnesota, you could hear all that going around, but we had curtains and our own television. I decided the best thing to get me through treatment was reruns of the Three Stooges. As brothers growing up, we would play Three Stooges, but being the oldest, I had to be Mo. That way I could take my brothers and knock their heads together, go, bang, bang. It was fun being the oldest. 5 minutes into session, and I'm feeling cold. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking now, I'm looking in the mirror, and perhaps the image of Mo is facing me. I'm being slapped. I'm getting cold. This is the revenge, I guess, I'm thinking, for all those years of torturing my brothers. 2 blankets isn't enough. I'm shivering. 3 blankets isn't enough. Though the blankets are warm, they're coming from a warm spot, they're heated. Finally, doctors and nurses are looking at the body temperature, and I guess when external things are going into one's body, external liquids, the temperature does lower. And they're saying, now perhaps with your body temperature being a certain way, perhaps we need to put you on some Demerol. I heard about Demerol. I heard that perhaps it was a popular drug out in the streets and that folks would pay hundreds of dollars for a simple pill, a simple bit of Demerol. Well, let me tell you, 2 minutes after the Demerol is entering the system, I'm wondering, what the hell do they find useful about this? My head is spinning, and there's no one in the room next to me except for this image of Mo slapping my head back and forth. And I'm wanting to reach for my phone and perhaps hold it as if it was going to be the closest thing to anyone holding my hand. I'm listening to voice messages from my daughter, pretending that she's holding my hand. Voice messages from various friends. I needed it. The next thing you know, it's all over. I'm released into the hallway. And I remember waiting through blast of sub-zero weather, waiting for the grumpy one to take me back to my St. Paul apartment. And it felt cold and lonely in this St. Paul apartment for once. Ice was in front of the windows. After being dropped off, there was no one to assist, no one for aid. I began to rely upon Facebook for rides. Go to the store for something that would take me 2 minutes of my own time in the past. And now my energy levels are different. Thought I could do something like take a load of laundry down 2 flights of steps to a laundry room in the St. Paul apartment. Going up and down those steps with just one basket of laundry was enough to put me in the bed for the rest of the day. Second, there was another day when cutting up vegetables for a morning omelet made me weak, and I called in my doctor. And the doctor sent me back to the hospital for another day for another set of blood transfusions. Then it was back to this quiet, cold apartment in St. Paul, Minnesota. I first arrived in Minnesota, and it happened to be in St. Paul in 1988, on the advice and counsel of Minnesota's former anti-war Senator Eugene J. McCarthy. I had the opportunity to, in 1968, the first presidential campaign that ever worked on was Senator Eugene McCarthy. And from that time, we began a correspondence, mostly talking, instead of politics, talking about poetry. Later on, in one of his quixotic third-party races for president, after a 1987 run for mayor of Denver, he asked me to be his running mate. It was thanks to Senator McCarthy is how I arrived here in the first place. I wasn't going to come originally. This was due to a personal situation, a divorce that put me in a situation to come to Minnesota in the first place. I was scared of the weather. I heard it was cold up here. And for the first 6 months of my time here, though the weather was warm, it still felt cold. Came up here not knowing a soul. It took a little door-to-door canvas job before I began discovering the joys of living in Minnesota, but still, my heart still was in Colorado. I love the Denver Broncos. And I hate the Minnesota Vikings. And this has nothing to do with having lived in Minnesota. This goes back to sibling rivalry. My youngest brother, although never having lived in Minnesota, liked the uniforms. He said purple uniforms are cool. This is exactly why youngest brothers are stupid. Doctors told me in the first few days coming home from the hospital that I was dangerously close to having a heart attack or stroke. And that post these transfusions, I need to take it easy. I guess if I'm supposed to take it easy, the thing I'm not supposed to do is turn on a Monday night football game featuring the Chicago Bears and the Minnesota Vikings. After all, the Chicago Bears featured an ex-Bronco, Jay Cutler. This is going to give me extra reason to see the Minnesota Vikings go down. And sure enough, in the cold of Soldier Field, this game is very exciting. Adrian Peterson's running up and down the field. Jay Cutler is fighting his receivers. And the heart is beating. I'm thinking, maybe the Minnesota Vikings are going to lead to my death. The heart is beating, and I know that I need to turn this TV off, but I'm not going to turn it off. I'm going to wait to see the Minnesota Vikings lose. For a minute or two, it did not seem it was going to happen. There was another Peterson run, and with 2 minutes to go, the Minnesota Vikings were ahead. I'm thinking at this point, perhaps now I need to turn the TV off. But the Minnesota Vikings are going to kill me. I'm going to wait till the very end. The heart's beating. I'm looking at the medicine that the doctors have given me. I still know I can hold off for a few more minutes. The heart is still beating. Cutler is marching down the field. Next thing you know, in Viking territory, there's a pass from Jay Cutler to Devin Aroma Shadu, and there's a touchdown Vikings lose! My heart survived the game. But if there was any clear sign that between the Colt and the Minnesota Vikings, it was now time to leave. And so I was off to Denver. One of the hardest things to do when faced with a difficult diagnosis such as stage 4 cancer is to tell the people around you what the situation and what the story is. Particularly if you're a parent. My daughter was preparing for a trip back to Colorado at the time this diagnosis came. When finally, after a day or two, I had the chance to talk to her. Now, growing up, my daughter and I had a thing going where I would tell her that I was Superman. And you know, even if they say they don't believe you, to a degree, for children, parents are Supermen and Superwomen. They do things that, as a child, you can't imagine doing yourself. So, there was a time once when I'm certain that perhaps my daughter thought perhaps I was Superman when she, thinking that I was asleep on a loft on our West Bank apartment, she decided to light a match. She got an idea what faster than the speed of sound was all about. But as a parent, when you're telling your own child about what the story is, there's a part of you that wants to remain that Superman. And so, the conversation will go something like this. Hey Rose, yes, I have cancer, but cancer's afraid of me. Remember, I'm Superman, remember? I'm hanging up and, inside I'm screaming, because I don't know what the hell is going to happen next. But at least I have to keep the myth alive that I taught Michael Jordan everything he knew about basketball. I think when something like that takes place, it's the beginning of the end of myths, shattering of myths. I know for myself, there was a way I thought my own parents were Supermen, Superwomen. And I think that's part of the grieving process when parents go on, because you never want to really believe that we're human like the rest of us. At the same time, we have to put on that front face, assuring that everything is going to be all right. But you never know. Then there are folks like Jazzy J. I first met Jazzy J when I was given a call to appear on his new project they used to call Twin Cities Radio on the Net. It gave local Minnesota performers an opportunity to get exposed, their music and work exposed online. The first time I appeared on Jazzy J's show, he told me to appear at his uptown Minneapolis apartment. But Jazzy's last name was Hendricks, not like the musician, But when you walked into his uptown apartment, you thought between all the cords and wires and computer equipment for Twin Cities on the net, that perhaps in some way he was related to Jimmy. Jazzy Jay loved music, and he loved the people who created it. Now he knew that I wasn't a musician per se, but much of the work of the Reggae Theater Ensemble and then later on spoken word entrees had a musical feel. So in addition to me bringing the poetry, we brought drums. And those drums took up most of the rest of the living room. We did our thing and left. But I continued talking with Jazzy, and as it turned out, found out that Jazzy had a very terminal cancer condition. For a while after that first appearance, we thought we may never see him again. Sure enough, Jazzy turned things around. And in another year or two, I'm getting another call from Jazzy inviting me to appear on his program again. This time, I came alone. But he had other guests. Sarah Prey was there. And Charlie Parr was there. I spun some stories. Sarah sang. Charlie sang. Charlie said later on, I like those stories. One of these days we'll have to do something together. At the time, I never imagined that later on I'd be talking to Jazzy about my own cancer condition. But despite his condition, which seemed to worsen by the month, I could count on a phone call, checking in, seeing how things were. Now, Jazzy did something that I chose not to do. Jazzy continued to have this tobacco and continued to book his shows. He said to me, can't let this stuff get to you. You got to keep on living just the way and go out the way you came in, doing what you love. Jazzy and I continued that correspondence until 2 weeks before his own passing. Then there was Ross T. Ross T and I went back all the way through my time in Denver. We first met in Denver's equivalent to Lake Street on Colfax Avenue. Now, if you know anything about Colfax Avenue in Denver, that's not normally the place that you're going to be expected to meet the best of friends. But that's where I met Ross T on a bus headed to a reggae show. That friendship continued, and whenever, even after returning to Minnesota, when I would make my trips to Denver, Ross T's house was often the destination. Now you gotta know one thing about me and Ross T. Going to his place was like being 20 years old over again. The ongoing joke was when I would arrive at Ross T's apartment, that was my turn to buy the toilet paper. And most of the time when I would appear at Ross T's apartment, that was the case. There was to walk to 7-Eleven and pick up the toilet paper, because he didn't have it. There was was our place for a party. Now, one thing you learn kind of quickly in facing this condition is that perhaps a party house is a little bit different from what needs to be in a sick house. And yes, there were moments when, once before going to treatment, I'm mopping the floor, washing some of the dishes that had remained from my last visit to Denver, and laying in the bachelor couch. But then I began noticing, like, within a couple of days, there's this itching up my leg. I'm thinking at first maybe it has something to do with, perhaps this is a reaction to treatment. But next thing, Ross T is feeling the same thing. He's scratching his arms and itching. I'm wondering what the hell is going on here. And it would be worse at night when we would fall asleep. One moment I wake up and I turn lights on and I see what our culprit is. Ross T's apartment is now infested with bed bugs. Oh. Treatment is now seeming like a relief. I'm hoping as I'm itching, as they're putting the treatment and stuff on my arms, I'm not noticing too many scratches and bumps and bites. A couple of times I decide to instead of going home after treatment, I'm going to spend the time on my daughter's floor in her apartment. You know, kind of sucked after a while, thinking that perhaps I might win this war against cancer and lose the war against bed bugs. But soon after that, we moved out of that apartment and things began to get a little bit better. It may come as a great surprise to some of you that I have a long history with marijuana. It began in high school. Actually began before that, in 1968, when, because of my appearances in the Eugene McCarthy presidential campaign, I was accused for the first time by my folks of smoking marijuana. It happened again when watching this old CBS News documentary on Haight-Ashbury, when I made the statement that if marijuana was making some of these folks peaceful, that perhaps there was something good about it. At that time, I never knew what it was about. Had never smelt it, didn't know what it looked like. And being the bookworm that I was, I read before deciding to inhale. Child's Garden of Grass. But then, in 1972, on a senior camping trip in the upstate New York in the Adirondack Mountains, I tried marijuana for the first time. When I returned, it caused me to thoroughly explore the works of Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson. But like any 20-year-old, late teens, early 20s, there was that recreational period. And it's amazing that not more of us have Alzheimer's from smoking pot out of Coke cans. But then later on came the spiritual application. Through journeys, I discovered that Rasta was me, was I. A spiritual path that didn't deny my black hippie. But then later on, upon arriving in Minnesota and eventually finding my way onto the West Bank, working at the new Riverside Cafe, living in the Holsterman, having music virtually at every corner, I began to discover its creative power. And out of that creative power came Malcolm X and Peter Tosh, a play that landed back in Denver, was the 1994 Cultural Event of the Year, according to Alan Dumas of the old Rocky Mountain News. Following that came I. Edgar Hoover, followed by Colorado, A Western Tale, a show that put me in New York and Germany, amongst other places. I have heard reports that marijuana had its healing qualities. But the real reason that I knew that I had family in Colorado, I'm figuring that if I'm going to be dealing with this disease and it is perfectly legal in Colorado, I'm just going to spend my time getting high and forgetting about all this. You know, the funny thing was, those first couple of months, I couldn't smoke marijuana. My oxygen levels were too low, and it was too painful to smoke. Besides, there was the matter of obtaining the official medical marijuana card. Now, like I told you, there was a bad family in Colorado. One of my relatives, cousin Debbie, said she was going to take care of it. After about a few weeks' time, she said, it is time to go get your card. Now, I assumed that perhaps I knew the rules, the regulations. You had to go see a doctor. The doctor had to recommend. And the reason that doctors have to recommend instead of prescribe marijuana was because federal laws and federal regulations made it so that if a doctor were to recommend its use, that doctor would be subject to federal charges. So they had to play with the language a little bit. I was a little bit nervous to ask my doctor at the Rocky Mountain Cancer Center would it be okay to use marijuana for my treatment. But I also know, given the fact that it was legal, that I could also write it down as part of my prescription. So I decided to forego asking my original cancer doctor and decided to go to one of the dispensary doctors that were popping up all over Denver, Colorado. My cousin decided he was going to take me to one of these spots. I didn't expect walking into an office building. 3-4 stories up. It could have been any type of business office. I walk in, there's a room. My cousin Debbie says, a month before you got here, this was an opportunity for the doctor or whatever to experiment to see how much marijuana you can consume before making its recommendation. This wasn't going to work for me, and now this room was empty. We come face the receptionist, and the receptionist had some sort of Russian accent. "So you come to get your card," she says. I hand her all my documents. "Go to this room," she says. I'm figuring it's time for another recommendation. She's going to give me just like I've gone to other doctors, they're going to check me out, treat me, and make a determination. 10 minutes later, she walks in. "I think you will be fine. You will get your card. Just do this. We have given you a recommendation. Now, can you pay your $125 check, and you can leave this office." Sure enough, there was the $125 check. Now I needed to go and mail another check to the state of Colorado. And then 2 weeks later, I get this in the mail. My first legal medical marijuana card. Within a month of that treatment,